Different data standards and regulations, in the clinical practice world, in the EHR world, HL7 has been the organization that has generally developed and maintained a lot of the data standards and how data has been for the purpose of connectivity. CDISC has done a great job of trying to harmonize with the clinical practice world and make it easier for data to be exchanged between research and clinical practice systems. Also, the regulatory differences, where on the research side, everyone thinks about 21 CFR Part 11. On the clinical practice and EHR side, we think about CCHIT certifications and those types of things. So, and there's new work being done to begin to harmonize some of that as well, too, that I'll talk about in a moment. Next slide, please. There's a little bit of delay in the change, so maybe a little pause there. What the opportunities for the vendor community as it relates to EHR adoption and clinical research is that there really it really opens up new ways for us to help transform healthcare with analytics and research arising from the aggregation of electronic patient data. There are also new customers for us to think about. In the past, we sold our systems to medical practices, to healthcare systems, to hospitals, and now there are data issues and tools to interact with the data that can be made available to the pharmaceutical industry, to government, and both parties are interested in the data coming from EHR systems. They know it's easy. It's a fairly direct route to work with EHR vendors to potentially have access to that, so that there's a whole new set of customers that we're thinking about for some of these solutions, and new solutions altogether. So in the past, we were focused on providing financial and administrative systems to medical practices, to hospitals and EHR and clinical documentation systems. Now we're looking at what are the things that can make those systems be used in alignment with research to help our providers be more productive as they participate in clinical research. We've interviewed many practices to see, how are they using their EHRs in clinical research and what kinds of other things would they like to see, such as being able to, in real time, when a patient walks through the door, know whether or not that patient could potentially be a match for a clinical trial that they're involved as being an investigator or that someone in the area is. And it's now possible to deliver those types of things, and I'll talk about a few of those in a moment. And then solutions for pharma and government to help improve research, safety, and population health. So being able to create tools that work with our data so that the research community can very quickly answer questions with that data, interact with that data, and save time in the research process. Next slide, please. Again, sorry about the slight pause. The impact of EHR adoption on clinical trials and research is really, there are two places where you really need to focus to see how the world is going to change as a result of the adoption of EHRs. The first being new processes at the point of care, and I'll expand upon that at the moment. And second, the availability of electronic patient data and what that's going to do to enhance research and surveillance for the purpose of prevention of disease and the prevention of pandemics and other things that are hot on people's minds today. Next slide, please. So when we think about new processes at the point of care, the adoption of EHRs and the use of EHR alongside in practices where research is taking place, there are a lot of new innovative things that can can be employed to accelerate what happens in research. So one of the things that we've recently introduced at Allscripts is the ability to alert providers that a patient may be a match for a clinical trial, including newly diagnosed patients. So the perfect world is that when a patient walks in and they're newly diagnosed, and it may be that one of the most innovative approaches or therapies available may still be in research, that a physician will know in real time that this patient could potentially be helped by a clinical trial that maybe is already that it is being handled at their practice or within their health system, and be able to quickly route that patient and offer that patient a new therapy that wouldn't otherwise be available. Our CEO, Glenn Tillman, who's very involved in the Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation's son, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes a long time ago, and at the time was put on a therapy that disqualified him for being able to be to qualify for an important clinical trial. And so one of the goals of some of the things that we're doing is to try to enable at the point of care a clinician who's using a system to be able to be alerted that a patient could be a fit for a trial right when they're newly diagnosed. And those kinds of things could be tremendous advances for clinical research in the U.S. Electronic chart reviews versus paper. I don't think a lot of people think about this, but as soon as a practice adopts an EHR and the paper record then goes into either long-term storage or is scanned electronically and is no longer available, there is no paper to go back to. And so the concept of monitors who go on site to review the documentation have to do it in a different way. And we as vendors have to think about, well, how do we enable a monitor to look in an electronic record without seeing other information that might be pertinent to a patient that might, break the glass on a privacy issue. So we're having to think about things like creating new roles for monitors within the EHR so that when somebody's going to do a chart review, it can be done electronically. The efficiencies in doing that are tremendous because you may be able to do remote electronic chart reviews without having to go on site and accomplish much of the same benefit in that process. Real-time adverse event reporting, another thing that is possible once you have EHRs deployed at the point of care, where the EHR could trigger based on a medication that was canceled or a side effect that was noted, an automatic event report such as the MedWatch form that could be triggered and sent electronically to an organization that's monitoring such things. This could be a tremendous breakthrough and could be very important both in clinical trials world, but also for the monitoring of various outbreaks of disease that are being watched from a population health perspective. Import of EHR data into EDC. This is something that I know Becky Cush has been very involved with CDISC in looking at how can we leverage the electronic patient data that's already available electronically in systems in the practices that may be conducting research to be able to pass some of that information electronically directly into EDC so that there's not duplicate entry of information where errors can occur, and so that time can be saved, and so frustrations can be eliminated because, as was mentioned earlier, if 30% of sites are never able to recruit a patient and many of them, drop out of participating in research altogether, if you can eliminate some of that frustration and some of that duplication of administrative burden, you will get more practitioners interested in participating in research and able to participate in research. So, the efficiencies that can be gained by linking these two worlds is very important, both from the researcher's perspective, but also at the point of care and the practitioners who may be conducting some of the actual research with the subjects. Next slide, please. The other big thing to think about, it, and it has been mentioned over and over and over, is what happens now with the availability of data from EHRs. A much broader, richer clinical data picture, longitudinal data in many cases, across the life of a patient who's been seeing the same practitioner for many, many years. The availability of this data in a de-identified and in aggregate forms is just has tremendous potential for enabling us to advance healthcare and to advance research in many, many ways. We've experimented with, and we know other vendors have experimented with, ways to improve feasibility testing, for example, for CROs and research organizations that are trying to determine what is the right structure for a clinical trial protocol and what is the right process for running a clinical trial. If they can in real time have the ability to screen aggregate data over tens of millions of patients, they can get a much better picture of and a much more specific picture of what they're going to encounter when they actually go to recruit for that clinical trial. And it can save a lot of time and tens of millions of dollars by having that electronically done in advance of the study. Site selection, and a lot of people don't realize the true power of being able to select your research site based on where candidates are already being seen and already have a trusted relationship with a medical practice. It's much easier to recruit a patient or for a clinician who's acting as a researcher to recruit one of their own patients who they have a trusted relationship with, as opposed to someone at random in the community who might just hear about a clinical trial and who they don't have a relationship with. So the ability to screen data in advance and select patients or actually select the research sites based on how many patients are already being seen at that site that are a match for a trial will also be able to save tens of millions of dollars for research organizations that are trying to determine which sites are going to be the most productive sites for them. If 1 in 3 sites never recruits a patient, imagine how much better they'll be if they can pre-screen sites and know how many patients are already a fit for their protocol before they select sites. And that's something that just hasn't been done effectively in the past, and that EHR data will allow them to do much more effectively.
Steve Schwartz, Steve Ruberg, in order to keep us on time, I'm going to ask you to accelerate through some of your remainder of points and slides, if you could, please.
Sure, will do. So just all the other benefits from the availability of data, improved validation, using secondary sources of data to validate research, better safety signal detection. Once you can, in real time, screen data electronically over tens of millions of patients, you'll be able to see signals faster and we'll be able to improve surveillance. Next slide, please. The other question is EDC systems, and I mentioned this briefly earlier, that were developed to address the needs of pharma to speed the collection of data because there were no EHRs at the point of care. Now that there are EHRs and adoption is occurring rapidly, providers only want to deal with one system. They only want to learn one system. And so it's important for these two worlds to kind of come together in some way. It'll happen through the standards organizations that are beginning to create interoperability standards and workflow standards, which CDISC has been great in facilitating. But there's also a financial question: who pays for it? Since the EHR vendors really don't have a stake in the benefit on the research side, it's really the research community that does. And so, is pharma going to pay for it? Is our CRO going to pay for it? Is someone else? And so that still remains a question that needs to get worked through. Next slide, please.